I wonder if you remember this feeling. That quiet moment when the world seemed to slow down enough for you to breathe. Before everything started blinking, buzzing, demanding your attention. Before life became loud in ways that never truly sounded like music. I remember it like it was yesterday. The way mornings felt heavier, slower, but kinder. The air had a warmth to it, even when it was cold. And time didn't chase us back then. It walked beside us. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine it's the 1970s in America. Not the version from history books, but the one that lived in your bones. The one you felt. I remember waking up to sunlight slipping through thin curtains. Dust dancing quietly in the air. The room smelled faintly of fabric softener, old wood, and yesterday's coffee. No alarms screaming, no glowing screens waiting to steal my thoughts. Just the distant sound of a lawnmower, a screen door slamming, a radio murmuring somewhere down the street. Life didn't rush me, it invited me. I remember the weight of silence back then. Real silence. The kind that didn't feel empty, but full of meaning, full of presence. The streets at dusk were calm, almost sacred. You could hear your own footsteps, your own breathing, your own thoughts, and somehow, that was enough. If you're here because you miss that world, if part of you still longs for a time when things felt simpler, slower, more human, then stay with me. And if you want to keep revisiting these forgotten moments, these pieces of a life that shaped who we became, subscribe to the channel. Let's remember the good things together, before they fade even further. Because the 1970s weren't perfect, but they were real. I remember the feeling of sitting at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a warm mug, the surface slightly chipped from years of use, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second felt, not wasted. Time had texture back then, you could almost touch it. Outside, the neighborhood felt alive without being noisy. Kids' laughter echoed down the block. Bicycles rattled over cracked sidewalks. Someone's dog barked lazily, more out of habit than urgency. And adults talked to each other, face to face, without distraction. We didn't document life, we lived it. I remember how evenings stretched on forever. The sky slowly changing colors, orange melting into purple, purple surrendering to night. Streetlights flickering on one by one, like quiet guardians watching over us. There was comfort in knowing where everyone was. There was safety in familiarity. Back then, meaning wasn't something we searched for online. It was woven into small rituals. Dinner together, a familiar voice on the phone, a handwritten note, a knock on the door instead of a notification. And maybe that's why the memories linger, because they weren't trapped in a device. They lived inside us. As I look back now, I realize something quietly profound. We didn't have much, but somehow, it felt like we had everything. The 1970s weren't just a decade, they were a state of mind, a rhythm of life that trusted patience, a world where moments were allowed to breathe. And as I continue remembering, I can't help but ask myself, what did we lose when time started moving too fast? Let me take you deeper. I remember how the days unfolded without urgency, not because we had nowhere to be, but because being present mattered more than being fast. Mornings didn't feel like a race, they felt like an arrival. I would step outside and feel the texture of the air on my skin, sometimes heavy with summer heat, smelling of cut grass and hot asphalt, other times crisp and dry, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant fireplaces. Even the weather felt honest back then. It didn't apologize for itself. I remember the sound of newspapers hitting the porch, that dull, comforting thud that told you the world was still turning, slowly, predictably. Ink-stained fingers, headlines read carefully, not scrolled past. You didn't consume the news, you absorbed it. There was a kind of trust in routine, a belief that tomorrow would resemble today enough to feel safe. We didn't crave constant novelty. We found meaning in repetition. I remember riding in cars that didn't whisper, they rumbled. Bench seats warm from the sun. Seatbelts that felt optional, not enforced. The radio crackling softly as a familiar voice introduced a song that would later become part of our soul. Music wasn't background noise, it was a companion. Every song felt like it belonged to a moment, and every moment felt permanent. I remember how conversations sounded, slower, thoughtful, uninterrupted. People looked at each other when they spoke. Silences weren't awkward, they were respected. You could pause, reflect, breathe, without feeling the need to fill the space. There was a different psychology at work back then. We weren't constantly comparing ourselves to the entire world. Our universe was smaller, and because of that, it felt manageable. We measured life by faces we knew, streets we walked, hands we held, and somehow, that made us feel whole. I remember evenings when the TV was on, but no one was truly watching. It glowed softly in the corner, while stories unfolded at the table instead. Laughter rose and fell naturally. Disagreements stayed human. No one stormed off into another digital universe. If you were upset, you stayed. You talked. You worked through it. That kind of patience shaped us. It taught us endurance, not the loud kind, but the quiet strength of staying present. Outside, the neighborhood breathed as one organism. Doors unlocked, windows open. You knew who lived where, not because of an app, but because of shared history. Because you'd waved at each other for years. There was comfort in that recognition, in being known, even imperfectly. I remember how time felt thicker at night, as if darkness slowed everything down on purpose. Crickets sang with unwavering dedication. The hum of distant traffic was low, almost hypnotic, and when I lay down to sleep, my mind wasn't crowded. No endless notifications, no invisible audience, just thoughts drifting gently, memories, hopes, unfinished conversations. Sometimes I think that's what we miss most, not the objects, not the fashion, not even the places, but the mental space. Back then, the mind had room to wander, to remember. And maybe that's why the 1970s still call to us, because they remind us of who we were before the noise convinced us we needed more. I didn't know it then, but I was living inside something sacred, and it was slipping through my fingers, one quiet day at a time. I remember the houses, not just the way they looked, but the way they felt. They carried stories in their walls, memories soaked into the wood and carpet. You could smell dinner long before you reached the front door. Something simmering, something familiar, something that meant you belonged. The floors creaked under your feet, not as a flaw, but as a greeting, as if the house itself recognized you. Furniture was heavy, solid, meant to last. Coffee tables scarred by years of use. Sofas that held the shape of everyone who had ever rested there. I remember how kitchens were the true heart of the home, not designed for beauty but for living. The hum of conversation mixed with the clink of dishes, hands moving out of habit, not instruction. Recipes memorized, not downloaded. There was a certain humility to everyday life. We didn't curate our homes for strangers. They were made for us. I remember how evenings gathered people together, neighbors stopping by without warning. The sound of a knock on the door that didn't bring anxiety, only curiosity. Coffee poured, chairs pulled closer, time stretched, unnoticed. There was no sense of intrusion. Presence was a gift, not an inconvenience. I remember the way children moved through those spaces, bare feet on cool floors, the echo of laughter bouncing down hallways, scraped knees, sticky fingers, endless imagination. We didn't need to be entertained. We created our own worlds. And the adults, they carried weight in their posture, not exhausting responsibility, the quiet burden of providing, protecting, enduring. They didn't talk about stress the way we do now. They simply carried it. There was dignity in that silence. I remember the subtle rituals, the way someone always adjusted the thermostat the same way, the same chair claimed at the table, year after year, the same radio station turned on every morning. These small repetitions anchored us. They reminded us who we were. Back then, psychology lived in gestures, not labels. Comfort came from familiarity. Security came from predictability. And identity was shaped slowly through years, not trends. I remember the light in the late afternoon, soft, amber, almost forgiving. It made even ordinary rooms feel important, like life itself was pausing, just to watch us exist. There was a spirituality hidden in those moments, not spoken, not named, but felt, a sense that something greater was present, in shared meals, in quiet companionship, in simply being together without needing more. And now, when I think back, I realize how rare that kind of togetherness has become. We gained convenience, but we lost density. Life became thinner. In the 1970s, moments had weight. They stayed with you. They shaped you. I didn't know it at the time. None of us did. But those houses, those rooms, they were holding us in ways we only understand now. And as the years moved forward, quietly, relentlessly, those walls watched us change. Some of the people inside them would leave. some would never come back, and the houses would remain, silent witnesses to a time when life felt whole. Let me tell you about the streets next. I remember the streets as if they were living beings. They had moods, personalities, rhythms of their own. You could tell what time it was just by the way the street sounded. In the early morning, everything felt hushed and respectful, the pavement still cool from the night. A single car passing by, tires whispering against the road. Someone walking a dog, moving slowly, as if neither of them wanted to break the calm. By afternoon, the streets came alive without chaos. Children chalking shapes that would vanish by tomorrow. The distant bounce of a basketball. Bikes leaning carelessly against fences. Voices calling out names, not usernames, real names, carried on the air. I remember how safe it felt. Not because nothing bad ever happened, but because we trusted the world a little more. Doors were left unlocked. Mothers watched from windows instead of screens. If you fell, someone helped you up, no questions asked. There was a shared responsibility, an unspoken agreement that the street belonged to all of us. I remember the smell of summer afternoons, hot concrete, sun-warmed metal, fresh laundry hanging outside, swaying gently like quiet flags of ordinary life. Even time itself seemed to slow under that heat, and when evening came, everything softened. The noise lowered its voice. Shadows stretched long across the sidewalks. Porch lights flicked on one by one, a constellation at ground level. That light meant something. It meant home. It meant supper was ready. It meant the day was gently closing its eyes. I remember sitting on front steps, feeling the rough texture of concrete under my hands, listening, not to anything specific, just listening to life. A radio playing somewhere far away, laughter drifting from a neighbor's yard, the low murmur of adults talking about work, weather, tomorrow. There was no urgency in those conversations. Tomorrow could wait. The streets taught us patience. They taught us how to observe without needing to react, how to exist without performing. I think about that now, in a world where streets are often empty. Not because people aren't there, but because they're somewhere else. Inside screens, inside thoughts that never rest. Back then, presence was physical. If you wanted to be part of life, you stepped outside. There was philosophy in that simplicity. A quiet understanding that life happens here, not somewhere else. That meaning isn't downloaded, it's encountered. I remember the first streetlights turning on as a signal, not a command, a gentle reminder that time was moving forward. That childhood had limits, that nights belonged to reflection, and when darkness finally settled in, the streets rested, not abandoned, just asleep, waiting for the next day to begin again. Those streets shaped us. They taught us how to belong to a place, to feel rooted, and when we left them behind, we carried their silence with us, even if we didn't realize it. Because once you've known that kind of stillness, you spend the rest of your life trying to find it again. I remember the people, not as faces frozen in photographs but as presences, as voices, gestures, habits that lingered in the air long after they were gone. Everyone seemed to carry a certain gravity, a seriousness softened by warmth. People had lived through things, and it showed not as bitterness, but as depth. Their smiles came slower, but they meant more. I remember the elders most clearly, the way they sat, the way they spoke without needing to impress. Their words were measured, seasoned by time. They didn't rush to fill silence because they trusted it. There was wisdom in that restraint. I remember neighbors who knew your name and your story, who remembered where you came from, not just where you were going. They asked real questions, and when they listened, they stayed. There was a kind of emotional economy back then. Feelings weren't performed, they were shared carefully. Pain was carried quietly. Joy was simple and sincere. Psychologically, we were anchored. Our sense of self came from belonging, not broadcasting. We weren't building personal brands, we were building lives. I remember how friendships formed, slowly, naturally, through shared routines, not forced interactions. You earned trust over time, not through constant availability. And when someone was missing, it was noticed. Absence had weight. I remember the way people dressed not for attention, but for dignity. Clothes were chosen with care, worn in, repaired, passed down. They carried stories in their seams. And when people aged, they were allowed to age. Wrinkles weren't hidden, they were accepted. They were proof of survival. There was a spirituality in that acceptance, a quiet reverence for the passage of time. I remember conversations that unfolded over hours, sometimes about nothing at all, sometimes about life, loss, purpose. No one checked the time, no one looked away. We were present for each other. And now, when I think about those people, so many of them gone, I realize something painful and beautiful. They didn't know they would become memories. None of us do. That's the cruel poetry of time. It turns ordinary moments into sacred ones only after they've passed. In the 1970s, people didn't speak often about meaning. They lived it. Through consistency, through presence, through showing up. And maybe that's why their absence hurts so deeply now. Because they shaped us in ways that can't be replaced. I carry their voices inside me. Their pauses, their laughter, their quiet strength. They are part of who I became. And as the world moved forward faster, louder, brighter, their way of being slowly faded, but not completely, because every time I slow down, every time I choose depth over speed, I feel them again, still teaching, still guiding. Even now, I remember the nights. They felt deeper back then, almost sacred. Darkness wasn't something to escape, was something to enter. When the sun disappeared, the world didn't glow artificially. It softened. Shadows grew longer. The air cooled and wrapped around your skin like a quiet promise of rest. I remember lying in bed, listening, not to noise but to distance. A car passing far away, a train horn echoing faintly, carrying stories to places I'd never see. Crickets performing their endless ritual, steady and devoted. The mind had room to wander at night. No constant stimulation, no endless feeds. Just thoughts rising and falling like slow waves. Sometimes I would think about the day, about things said and unsaid, about people I loved, about time without fear, without urgency. Sleep came naturally. It wasn't forced. I remember how bedrooms felt like sanctuaries, simple, familiar, the faint smell of detergent on clean sheets, the weight of blankets grounding you in the present moment. There was comfort in routine, the same lamp, the same nightstand, the same window framing, the same stretch of sky, night after night. Psychologically, those nights gave us something rare today, mental closure. The day ended, and the mind was allowed to rest. I remember how the moonlight slipped through curtains, casting soft shapes on the walls. Those shapes felt like quiet companions. They reminded me I wasn't alone in the darkness. There was a spiritual stillness to it all, as if the world itself paused to breathe. And when worries came, and they did, they came slowly. You had time to sit with them, to understand them. Not everything needed to be solved immediately. Now, nights often feel crowded, filled with glowing screens and restless thoughts. But back then, the night belonged to reflection. It taught us patience with ourselves. It taught us how to sit with silence without fear. I think that's why sleep felt deeper, dreams felt heavier, more symbolic, more personal. The night was a mirror, and in that mirror, we saw ourselves clearly, without filters, without distractions. The 1970s nights didn't promise happiness, they offered truth, and somehow, that was enough. Even now, when the world finally goes quiet, I sometimes catch a glimpse of that darkness again, and for a moment, I feel at home. I remember the way weekends felt. They didn't arrive with a notification, they unfolded. There was a softness to them, a permission to slow down without guilt. Saturday mornings carried a different kind of light, less hurried, more forgiving. The smell of breakfast lingered longer in the air. Coffee brewed slowly, pancakes sizzling, filling the house with warmth and comfort. There was no urgency to leave, no invisible pressure to optimize the day. Time felt generous. I remember simple outings, hardware stores, small diners, local markets, places that didn't try to impress but welcomed you anyway. The same faces behind the counters, the same casual conversations, repeated over years. You were known there, and that mattered. I remember the feel of coins in my hand, the sound they made when placed on a counter. Money felt physical, real. You could feel its weight, its limits. Spending was thoughtful, not impulsive. There was psychology in restraint, in knowing when enough was enough. I remember afternoons stretching endlessly. Baseball on the radio, the slow rhythm of the game mirroring the pace of life. Even if you weren't watching, it felt comforting to know it was there. Time wasn't something to defeat, it was something to move alongside. And Sundays were sacred in their own quiet way. Not always religious but reflective. The world seemed to lower its voice. I remember wearing slightly nicer clothes, even if there was nowhere special to go. a sign of respect for others and for yourself. There was dignity in that effort. Family visits, long conversations, moments where nothing dramatic happened, but everything felt meaningful. The week prepared us to endure. The weekend reminded us why. There was a balance back then, between work and rest, between effort and pause, between doing and simply being. Today, weekends often feel like extensions of work, but in the 1970s, they felt like a return to yourself. They offered restoration, not escape. And when Sunday evening arrived, there was a quiet acceptance, a gentle sadness, maybe, but also stability. You knew where you belonged. You knew what tomorrow would bring. There was comfort in that predictability, a sense of order that calmed the nervous system. I didn't realize it then, but those weekends were teaching us how to live with rhythm. And once that rhythm is lost, the heart never quite forgets its tempo. Even now, on quiet mornings, I feel it again. I remember the way work fit into life back then. Not always easy, not always fair, but it had edges you could see, limits you could respect. Morning routines carried a sense of purpose. The smell of soap and shaving cream, coffee poured into a sturdy mug, chipped at the rim but trusted, clothes chosen the night before, hanging patiently, waiting. Work didn't invade every corner of the day, it waited its turn. I remember the feeling of leaving the house with intention, keys in hand, a brief look back, as if to say, I'll return, and that promise mattered. Jobs were physical, tangible, rooted in place. You knew where your labor went, you could see the results. Hands grew tired, backs ached, but the mind rested differently. There was pride in completion. I remember lunch breaks that actually felt like breaks, sitting still, eating slowly, talking about ordinary things, weather, families, plans for the weekend. No constant urgency to perform, to impress, to stay visible. Work had an ending, and when it ended, it released you. Psychologically, that boundary meant everything. The self wasn't swallowed whole by productivity. You were more than what you did. I remember the sound of factories shutting down for the day, the sudden quiet after hours of motion, the collective exhale. Men and women stepping outside into fading light, carrying tiredness but also relief. There was dignity in honest fatigue. I remember coming home at night and feeling the shift immediately. Shoes off, a deep breath. The day gently placed behind you instead of dragged along. Even worry behaved differently then. It had limits. It didn't follow you into every room, every moment. And beyond work, there was leisure, real leisure. Not distraction, not escape, but engagement. I remember hobbies that required patience. Woodworking, gardening, fixing things instead of replacing them. Hands moving slowly, deliberately, time passing unnoticed. These activities weren't about mastery, they were about presence. I remember evenings spent reading the same book for weeks, pages folded, notes penciled in margins, stories absorbed deeply, not consumed quickly. There was psychology in slowness. It allowed identity to form quietly, without pressure. I remember how satisfaction came not from more but from enough. Enough food, enough work, enough rest. We didn't chase fulfillment. We stumbled into it through ordinary days. And spiritually, there was humility, an acceptance that life wasn't meant to be constantly extraordinary. That meaning lived in repetition, not spectacle. Now, when I think back, I realize how grounded we were, how anchored. We knew when to stop. We knew when to rest. We knew when a day was finished. And maybe that's what time has taken from us. Not effort, but closure. In the 1970s, life had chapters you could close at night, and in that closure, the soul found room to breathe. I didn't know it then, but that balance, that quiet agreement between effort and rest, was a gift, one we only recognize now, because it's gone. I remember the way news and information entered our lives, slowly, carefully, with weight. It didn't shout at us every minute. It arrived in the morning paper, folded and deliberate, or through the calm, steady voice of an evening anchor who spoke as if words mattered. There was time to process, to reflect, to disagree quietly. I remember sitting at the table, newspaper spread open, the smell of ink mixing with coffee, stories read from beginning to end, no endless updates, no urgency to react immediately. Information didn't own us, it visited. Psychologically, that space mattered. It protected the mind from constant alarm. We were informed but not overwhelmed. I remember how events felt distant yet meaningful. The world was large, and we understood our place within it. There was tragedy, uncertainty, fear, but also perspective. You talked about it with others. You tried to make sense of it together. There was a collective processing of reality. I remember radios on kitchen counters and dashboards, the soft crackle between stations, music followed by news followed by silence. Nothing demanded your constant attention. And then there were letters. Real letters. Paper folded carefully. Handwriting that revealed emotion more honestly than words ever could. I remembered the anticipation, days waiting, imagining what might be written inside. The slow reveal as the envelope opened. Connection took effort, and effort gave it meaning. I remember phone calls that began with hesitation. You didn't call unless you had something to say. The voice on the other end felt precious because it was. Conversations ended naturally. No infinite loops, no fear of missing out. Relationships had breathing room. There was a philosophy hidden in that restraint, that not everything needs to be shared, that some moments belong only to memory. I think about that now, in a world of constant visibility, where silence feels suspicious, where absence feels like neglect. But in the 1970s, silence was normal, and presence was intentional. I remember how patience shaped us. Waiting taught us how to hope, how to tolerate uncertainty, how to live between moments. Time itself felt trustworthy. Spiritually, there was an acceptance of mystery. We didn't need answers immediately. Some questions were allowed to linger, and they made life deeper. As I look back, I realize how that slower flow of information protected something fragile inside us. Our inner world. We had space to think our own thoughts, to form beliefs quietly, to feel without constant comparison. And when something truly important happened, it landed. It stayed, because our minds weren't already full. The 1970s gave us that gift, a mind with room to echo. And even now, when I try to remember who I was, I don't look at records. I listen to that silence. It still speaks. I remember how time itself felt different in the 1970s, not slower in reality, but heavier in meaning. Each year seemed to leave a mark. You could feel yourself changing, growing, aging, and it didn't feel like a threat. Birthdays arrived without spectacle. A cake, a few candles, familiar faces. You didn't measure your life by milestones shared with strangers, but by quiet moments remembered only by those who were there. I remember how aging was accepted, not resisted. Hair turned grey without apology, bodies slowed without shame. There was a quiet respect for the passage of time. Psychologically, that acceptance gave us peace. We weren't in constant conflict with ourselves. We didn't fight the mirror, we learned from it. I remember how photographs were rare and precious. You didn't take 10 versions of the same moment. You waited. And when the picture was taken, it mattered. Memories lived primarily in the mind, and that made them sacred. I remember how the future felt distant but hopeful, not because it promised perfection, but because it felt stable. You could imagine a life unfolding slowly, predictably. Plans were modest, and because of that, they felt achievable. I remember how mistakes were allowed. There was room to fail quietly, to learn without being permanently defined by your worst moment. Life wasn't constantly archived, it moved forward. I remember how grief was carried, not publicly, not performatively, but shared in small circles, with patience and respect. Loss felt heavier, but also more human. There was a spirituality in that restraint, a recognition that some pain is too sacred for spectacle. I remember sitting alone sometimes, without distraction, thinking about life, about choices made and paths not taken. Those moments weren't scary, they were clarifying. Solitude was a teacher. Today, we often fear being alone with our thoughts. But in the 1970s, it was part of growing up. I remember how hope wasn't loud. It didn't shout promises. It whispered endurance. And maybe that's why disappointment felt different too. It hurt, but it didn't shatter identity. We were resilient in quieter ways. As I look back now, I realize something important. Time didn't just pass, it shaped us. It carved depth into our character. And when I compare that to today's constant acceleration, I feel a longing not for youth but for weight, for days that mattered simply because they existed. The 1970s taught us how to live inside time, not race against it, and that lesson still waits for us to remember. I remember the way fear existed back then. It was real, but it wasn't constant. It came in waves, not floods. There were worries, of course, about the economy, about the future, about the world beyond our neighborhoods. But fear didn't live inside our pockets. It didn't follow us everywhere we went. I remember how safety felt, imperfect, but trusted. Children played outside until the sky told them it was time to come home. Parents worried, but they didn't panic. They trusted the rhythm of the day. Psychologically, that trust shaped our nervous systems. We weren't always braced for impact. We weren't constantly alert. I remember how danger felt specific, not abstract. You knew what to watch out for. You didn't feel threatened by everything, all the time. There was clarity in that. I remember how news of tragedy traveled slower. It gave space for compassion to form naturally. Not instantly, not reactively, but deeply. People gathered, they talked, they processed together. Fear didn't isolate us, it connected us. I remember the absence of constant comparison. We didn't measure our lives against millions of others. We measured them against our own values. That protected something fragile inside us, our sense of enough. I remember how courage looked different. It wasn't loud or performative. It was steady. It was showing up to work, taking care of family, enduring quietly. There was dignity in that form of bravery. Spiritually, there was a belief, spoken or not, that life would continue. That hardship was part of the human story, not a personal failure. That belief softened fear. I remember moments of uncertainty, standing at crossroads without maps or guarantees, and somehow trusting that the path would reveal itself. Hope didn't promise ease, it promised meaning. Today, fear often feels like a background noise, but back then, silence still existed between worries, and in that silence, the soul could rest. As I look back now, I realize how rare that balance was. To be aware but not overwhelmed, concerned but not consumed. The 1970s didn't remove fear from life, they kept it in proportion. And maybe that's what we miss. Not safety but sanity. The ability to breathe between worries, to live without constantly preparing for the worst. That memory still feels like refuge. I remember how love was expressed back then. Not loudly, not constantly, but steadily. Affection lived in gestures more than words. A hand resting on a shoulder, a coat quietly placed around someone else's back, a look that said, "I see you," without needing explanation. I remember marriages that weren't perfect, but endured, not because people were happier, but because commitment meant something deeper than emotion alone. Love wasn't expected to fix everything, it was expected to stay. Psychologically, that stability shaped us. We grew up understanding that feelings rise and fall, but responsibility remains. I remember how arguments ended, not with silence forever, but with time, with cooling off, with the understanding that walking away didn't mean disappearing. There was space for repair. I remember friendships that lasted decades, not because people were always close, but because distance didn't equal abandonment. You could go months without speaking, and still feel connected. Relationships weren't fragile. They weren't constantly tested. They were built to weather seasons. I remember how love aged. It slowed down, it softened, it traded intensity for depth, and somehow, that made it stronger. I remember parents who didn't explain everything, who loved through provision, consistency, sacrifice. They didn't always say, "I love you," but they showed it every day. That kind of love shaped our understanding of duty, of loyalty, of showing up even when it was hard. Spiritually, there was a quiet belief that love was an action, not a feeling, that it required patience, that it demanded humility. I remember heartbreak too. It existed, but it wasn't broadcast. It was carried privately, respectfully. You were allowed to heal without being watched. Pain had dignity. I remember how intimacy wasn't rushed. It unfolded. It deepened over time. Mystery wasn't feared, it was cherished. Today, love often feels urgent, but back then, it was deliberate. It understood time. As I look back now, I realize how protected we were by that slowness, how it allowed bonds to root deeply before being tested. We weren't constantly questioning who cared. We knew. The 1970s didn't make love easy, they made it durable. And maybe that's why those connections still echo inside us, because they were built to last. Even now, when I think of love, that's the shape it takes. I remember how spirituality existed quietly in everyday life, not always named, not always practiced formally, but present. It lived in pauses, in gratitude before meals, in the way people lowered their voices when talking about life and death, in the respect given to things we didn't fully understand. Faith, whatever form, It wasn't performative. It wasn't argued constantly. It was carried inward, like a compass rather than a banner. I remember moments of stillness that felt almost sacred, sitting alone at dawn, standing outside at night, looking up at a sky unpolluted by artificial light. Stars, sharper, closer, more honest. You felt small but not insignificant. There was a philosophy of humility woven into daily life, an understanding that we were part of something larger, that control was limited, that certainty was an illusion, and strangely, that brought peace. I remember how questions about meaning didn't demand immediate answers. People wondered quietly. They lived their questions. Why are we here? What makes a good life? What happens when this ends? These weren't problems to solve. They were companions on the journey. I remember how death was spoken of with seriousness, not avoidance. Funerals were intimate. Grief was shared slowly. People showed up not with solutions, but with presence. There was a collective understanding that loss was part of love, that to care deeply meant risking pain. Spiritually, that acceptance grounded us. It taught us reverence for time, for people, for moments that would never repeat. I remember how rituals marked transitions, births, marriages, goodbyes. They weren't rushed, they were honored. Life felt structured by meaning, not convenience. Today, spirituality often competes with distraction, but in the 1970s, it lived in silence, in restraint, in the space between words. I remember sitting in a quiet room, doing nothing and feeling complete. No need to escape, no need to improve the moment. Just being was enough. As I look back now, I realize how nourishing that stillness was, how it allowed the soul to stretch out and breathe. We didn't chase transcendence. It found us, in ordinary days, in familiar faces, in the slow passage of time. And maybe that's why those memories feel so deep now, because they weren't shallow experiences, they were lived fully. The 1970s didn't offer certainty, they offered presence. And presence, I've learned, is its own kind of faith. I remember the feeling of change arriving quietly at first, not like a storm, more like a shift in the air that only later reveals itself. At the time, we didn't call it the end of an era, we just felt something loosening, something subtle slipping away. New things appeared, new habits, new rhythms that didn't quite match the old ones, and we adapted, because that's what people do. But I remember sensing it in small moments, conversations interrupted more often, patience thinning, time beginning to feel compressed. I remember when waiting started to feel inconvenient instead of natural, when efficiency quietly replaced presence, when progress began asking for more speed and less reflection. Psychologically, something shifted. The mind began leaning forward constantly, toward what was next, and the present moment grew lighter, easier to drop. I remember how spaces changed, stores brighter, sound sharper, life more crowded with signals asking for attention. None of it felt wrong at first, just different, and yet, something essential grew harder to find. I remember missing people who were still alive, because even when they were there, part of them was already elsewhere. Thinking ahead, planning, moving on. The shared pauses became rare. Spiritually, the world grew louder, and silence once familiar began to feel uncomfortable, as if stillness needed justification. I remember realizing one day that I couldn't hear my own thoughts as clearly, that the gentle inner voice had been replaced by urgency, and I missed it. The 1970s taught us how to dwell inside moments, but the years that followed taught us how to escape them. We didn't notice the cost immediately, because loss that happens slowly feels like normal life. But now, looking back, I see it clearly. We traded depth for convenience, continuity for novelty, weight for speed, and still, I don't feel anger about it, only tenderness, because change isn't cruel, it's indifferent. It moves forward whether we're ready or not. What hurts isn't that the world changed, it's that we didn't know what we were leaving behind while we still had it. We thought those days would always be there, waiting unchanged, but time doesn't preserve, it transforms. And the 1970s, that way of being, didn't disappear overnight. It faded quietly, like a song lowering its volume until one day you realize it's gone, yet somehow, you still remember the melody. And sometimes, in rare quiet moments, you hear it again. I remember the moment I realized those days were no longer just memories. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with sadness all at once. It came softly through comparison. I noticed how often I felt tired without having done much, how my mind felt full, yet unsatisfied, how silence had become something I had to search for, and without meaning to, I started looking backward, not because the past was perfect, but because it felt complete. I remembered how the 1970s asked less of us mentally, how life allowed us to be unfinished without feeling inadequate, how worth wasn't measured every moment. Psychologically, there was relief in that simplicity. We weren't constantly evaluating ourselves. We weren't always on trial. I remember the comfort of not being seen all the time, of making mistakes that stayed local, of growing privately. That privacy protected our becoming. I remember how identity formed slowly, through years of repetition, through habits, through commitment to place and people. You didn't reinvent yourself constantly. You deepened spiritually. That depth mattered. It allowed character to settle, values to root. Now, identity often feels fluid to the point of exhaustion. But back then, you knew who you were because you knew where you stood. I remember realizing that nostalgia isn't really about longing for objects or decades. It's about longing for a nervous system that felt safe, for a world that didn't demand constant vigilance. The 1970s gave us that safety not by removing hardship, but by giving life a rhythm that made hardship survivable. I remember how hope lived quietly in routine, in knowing that tomorrow would resemble today enough to feel manageable. That kind of hope doesn't shout, it steadies. And now, as years pile up behind me, I understand something I couldn't then. We don't miss being young. We miss feeling held by time instead of chased by it. We miss days that didn't ask us to be exceptional, only present. The 1970s were generous in that way. They let us be ordinary and find meaning there. And maybe that's the greatest loss of all. Not the era itself, but the permission it gave us to live quietly. That permission shaped us, and even now, it still whispers to us when we slow down enough to listen. I remember realizing, slowly, that the 1970s never truly left me. They didn't vanish with the years. They settled inside me. They became the way I breathe when the world feels too loud, the way I slow my steps without apology, the way I listen longer than I speak. What we lived back then shaped something permanent, not memories alone but orientation, a sense of how life should feel. I understand now that time doesn't just take things away, it also leaves traces, impressions on the soul. The 1970s taught us that life doesn't need constant stimulation to be meaningful. That depth comes from repetition. That love grows stronger when it isn't rushed. That silence can be kind. They taught us how to live inside moments, not as spectators, but as participants. And when I think of all the people who shared that time with me, some gone, some distant, some living only in memory now, I don't feel only sadness. I feel gratitude, because we were there. We lived it, we carried it forward. The world may have moved on, faster and brighter and noisier, but that way of being still exists, in quiet kitchens, in long conversations, in unhurried mornings, in evenings where nothing needs to happen. It exists every time we choose presence over urgency, depth over speed, meaning over performance. That's the true inheritance of the 1970s. Not an era, but a posture toward life. And maybe that's why remembering feels so comforting, because it reminds us that another rhythm is possible, that we've lived it before. The time that doesn't return still teaches. The places that disappeared still shelter us inside. The people who shaped our souls still speak through the way we love, the way we endure, the way we pause. And now, as I sit with these memories, I don't feel lost in the past. I feel anchored, because the 1970s were never just then. They were a lesson, one we carry forward, quietly, gently, faithfully, and as long as we remember how it felt to live that way, a part of that world is still alive, inside us,